I did something petty, and it spiraled into the biggest decision of my life. I stuck the note under the glass of the school board like it was nothing, like sliding a song into a playlist, quick, dumb, private. I didn't expect it to scream back. I remember the way my fingers trembled only when I folded the paper, a tiny square with 3 sentences that felt like a small, honest relief. Bennett makes jokes about kids who ask for help. It's not funny, it's cruel. Boom, that was it. No names, no dates, just an accusation that fit into the neat little box of our announcements board and then into my pocket and away from me. I walked back to math like I hadn't done anything at all. Honestly, I wanted vindication for the night she'd singled out Noah, for the way she'd laughed while the class pretended not to hear, for the way my chest tightened every time she looked at me like I should already know how to do everything. I wanted that small, petty satisfaction of a secret aired, a cocky teacher's casual cruelty called out where the light hits. I didn't want an avalanche, I did not want to be seen. I wanted the note to be like a match dropped into dry leaves, burn a little, go out, leave a dark little circle where someone else could maybe plant something kinder. I am the kind of person who solves problems quietly. I tidy, I send emails late at night, I make schedules, I wash the cups. I do not start fires. Except the note wasn't just noticed, it became a thing. Someone photocopied it and the copies spread. Someone, probably Layla or Sophia or Noah's older sister, someone who could not stand quiet, taped them to lockers and left stacks in the cafeteria like little paper soldiers. The school circulated an email that had the steely tone of adults who believe in process over emotion. And then parents started texting. And then somebody put an online petition together with a paragraph that read like it had been written by people who had been holding their breath for a long time. I learned fast that a small action in a small place can find a lever where you least expect it. It didn't help that social media in our town is just a long, sticky river where complaints turn into currents. People are thirsty for truth. Within 48 hours, there were students sharing stories under the hashtag that I will not repeat because I am not a masochist, and the principal called an emergency meeting that smelled like coffee and too clean air. I watched the movement I'd intended to be a whisper become a roar, and my stomach kept doing that slow, sick flip that warns you when a choice is about to land on your head. I thought anonymity would protect me from the consequences, but anonymity is a fragile, thin thing when a whole hall wants meaning. Someone guessed. Someone was always going to guess. Rumor ran like a cheap rumor does, and fingers pointed in circles because humans prefer geometry to complexity. I learned to listen for the way people said my name when they thought I couldn't hear, with curiosity at first, then with a tilt that could be pity or accusation. I couldn't tell which because those two sound the same when whispered. There were phone calls from parents asking if I knew, the way a voice asks if a child knows why an adult cannot sleep. There were texts from friends that tried to be casual. Are you okay? Which meant, are you ready to be the visible thing now? And my mom, who has a way of saying 3 sentences at once, asked if I had done something stupid and if I would tell her so she could fix it. I made small, practiced noises and told myself I'd figure it out later. Later is a luxury I hoard like spare change. The faculty meeting was brutal in the sterile way only institutions can be. Procedures, rehearsed empathy, the almost polite hostility of people who are more offended by the method than the content when the content implicates them. Ms. Bennett was quiet in a way that made people look twice. I watched her hands, the way they curled around a coffee cup, and I felt a strange alignment of things. The petty weight of my note, the true weight of what she did, and my own smallness pressed like a thumbprint into the movement I'd started. Students insisted meetings keep going until real change was promised, and parents demanded transparency, and somewhere in the middle, reporters asked for comment and for names. A teacher I admired told me in the hallway that sometimes unsanctioned disruptions are the only way the system notices pain. Her voice felt like glass that could cut or reflect. I believed her, and I also believed that I could remain anonymous and let the system do the changing like a machine doing its complex, slow work. Then the petitioners wanted a figurehead. Movements often want faces, it's how stories keep going. They wanted someone to stand in the door and say, I started this, to take interviews and answer questions about motives and to hold the weight of people's expectations. They said it would make the change more real if we claimed it, if we pointed a human at the issue instead of a ghost. They said it would protect everyone else. They assumed someone would volunteer. I thought of the note in my pocket like an animal that now needed a home. I thought of the kids who had finally said the words that had been stuck in their throats for years, of the new inbox full of messages asking for resources and follow-ups, and of Ms. Bennett's eyes the day she walked past me in the corridor and didn't look away. My chest felt like a locker slammed shut, like someone had closed me inside for safety or for punishment, and I couldn't tell which. It came down to a single evening, the air so hot I could taste metal, when my phone buzzed until I picked it up and found a string of messages that were a rope. "Can you meet? Are you coming? Please." We needed someone to sign an open letter that would move the board to buy training and institute accountability measures. We needed a voice to attach to the documents so they couldn't be dismissed as a prank. Everyone assumed the author would want credit. Everyone assumed I wanted to remain invisible. It felt like they were asking me to step into a floodlight or to hold a match over gasoline. I told myself I could be clever, sign the letter with a pseudonym, provide testimony through a lawyer, do everything that reduces personal risk. But the more I thought, the more I noticed that my silence would be an action too, a choice that would leave other people exposed and alone while I hid. That thought was the thing that finally moved me. My tendency to fix things quietly had always been a method of self-preservation, and here it would preserve my comfort at the cost of someone else's safety. That realization was ugly and red and honest. It did not let me sleep. When I finally raised my hand at the emergency assembly to speak, everyone thought I was going to read a prepared statement. Instead, I said, "I wrote the note," and the room inhaled like someone had opened a window in a closed car. There was noise immediately, 1,000 tiny ships of reaction launching. Some faces softened, some hardened, some looked away like people who'd just seen a person throw a stone through a window and were waiting for the glass to fall. I wanted to tell them everything, that I'd written it because I was tired and petty and human, that I hadn't intended this to become a movement, that I was scared. I wanted to tell Ms. Bennett that I saw her and I forgave her, or I didn't. I couldn't always tell which would be truer. Instead, I let them see me and not the plan. Let them watch as the person behind the paper stepped into the light and became both symbol and scapegoat. The consequences were swift and not all of them were bad. Some adults praised the courage to speak. Some students rallied like we had given them permission to be louder. The board promised reforms and set dates and consultants and the kind of careful language committees use when they want to both act and delay. Ms. Bennett was moved to an administrative role while investigations happened, and she wrote an email to the staff that was equal parts contrition and legal counsel. I read it and my chest fractured in half and then knotted back together in new ways. There was anger too. Anonymous notes were dug up, accusations about motives flew, and families accused me of trying to ruin a career. A teacher I respected told my parents that I'd done a brave thing and a reckless thing at the same time, and my parents sat across from me like people looking at a painting they didn't understand. I felt isolated even as people said my name in grateful sentences. Being the visible face of something gives others a place to focus their emotion, and that focus is heavy. Sometimes I regret the pettiness that started it, a note meant to make me feel better that would instead ask me to be brave in ways I hadn't planned for. Other times I don't, because I see a kid in the hallway who finally asked a question in class and didn't get laughed at, or because I read messages from students who felt seen for the first time. The biggest decision of my life wasn't whether to tell the truth. It was whether I would be the person who accepted the fallout so others could be safer. That decision has cost me friendships and given me an odd kind of belonging, and it has taught me that quiet fixes aren't always enough. I still clean the cups and make the schedules, but I no longer think being small is the only way to be useful. I can't go back and make the note unread, and I won't try. I stayed quiet for years, then finally told the truth about my family's secret. The first time I heard my mom laugh about it, I was 13 and sitting at the kitchen table with a headache so bad I could barely see straight. She was on the phone with my aunt, talking low and fast, and then I heard her say, No, it's just Ella being dramatic again. You know how she gets when she wants attention." I remember my hands going cold. I remember staring at my cereal until the milk went grey. I said nothing. Of course I said nothing. That was kind of my whole thing back then, being good, being quiet, being the girl who didn't make trouble. So I swallowed it and kept eating like I hadn't heard a word. Seriously, that was the start of it. Not the illness that had been there already in that heavy, sinking way I didn't know how to name. The start was realizing my own parents could look at me, see me barely holding myself together, and decide I was performing. After that I got very good at disappearing in plain sight. I kept my grades up. I smiled at the right times. I did my chores before anyone asked. If I cried, I did it into a pillow with the door locked. If I felt myself slipping, I told myself to wait until after the next test, the next family dinner, the next holiday. There was always another reason to wait. There was always someone more important. Mom liked to tell people I was sensitive, like that explained the way I stopped sleeping, the way my hands shook before school, the way I'd sit in the bathroom stall and press my forehead to my knees just to get through the day. Dad was worse in a quieter way. He didn't joke as much as Mom, but he backed her up with that tired little shrug, like my pain was an inconvenience we all had to manage. "She's fine," he'd say, "she just needs to toughen up." So I did what I was trained to do. I got tougher, or I looked tougher anyway. I learned how to answer "How are you?" with good, even when I was barely functioning. I learned how to lie with a straight face to doctors, teachers, and friends. I learned how to keep the family story intact. The family story was simple. Ella was smart, Ella was responsible, Ella was a little sensitive, but nothing serious. Nothing worth making a scene about. Nothing worth changing the way anyone talked. Then the emergency happened. I won't drag that part out because I still hate remembering it. One minute I was trying to get through a normal Saturday, the next I was on the floor, my chest ripping open with pain so sharp I thought I was dying. My older sister Talia found me first. She was the one who called for help, the one who kept saying my name while Mom panicked and Dad stood there white-faced and useless. In the ambulance, I couldn't stop shaking. At the hospital, they ran tests, asked questions, checked everything twice. And somewhere in all of that, with fluorescent lights burning my eyes and my body feeling like it belonged to someone else, a doctor asked if I had been under a lot of stress lately. I laughed, not because it was funny, because I didn't know what else to do. Talia was standing by my bed and I looked at her and said very calmly, "You mean besides years of being told I'm faking when I can't get out of bed?" The room went dead quiet. My mom's face changed first, not guilt, not yet. Shock. Like I'd broken a rule she thought still protected her. Dad said, "Ella, not now." That was all it took. Not now, not ever if he had his way. But something in me had already cracked open and I couldn't seal it back up. So I kept going. I said it all. I said how long I'd been struggling. I said I'd asked for help and been laughed at. I said I'd heard them make jokes about me being dramatic, lazy, attention-seeking, manipulative, all the little words people use when they want to make pain sound unserious. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. I looked right at my parents and said, "You didn't just misunderstand me. You taught me to mistrust my own pain." Mom started crying then, but not in the way I needed. More like the floor had dropped out from under her and she was trying to grab anything. Dad kept rubbing his face like he could erase the moment by rubbing hard enough. Talia was crying too, but she was angry, which helped. She said, "Do you hear her? Do you actually hear her?" I had never seen my sister look at our parents like that. It was terrifying. It was also the first time I didn't feel alone in that room. Afterward, everything got messy fast. Mom tried to say she didn't know it was that bad. Dad said I should have told them sooner. I almost laughed again. What was sooner? Earlier than 13. Earlier than the panic attacks I hid in the school restroom. Earlier than the nights I stayed awake counting breaths because I didn't trust myself to sleep. I told them, "I did tell you, you just didn't like what I was saying." That line landed harder than I expected. Dad actually went silent. Mom looked away. For once, there was nothing to joke about, nothing to brush off, nothing to minimize into harmless family banter. The truth had a shape now, and it sat between us like a piece of wreckage nobody knew how to step around. The days after that were awkward in a way I can't fully explain. Mom kept trying to talk. Sometimes she'd start with an apology and then wander into excuses before she even finished the sentence. Dad avoided me at first, then got weirdly formal, like we were co-workers instead of people who'd lived together for years. Talia checked on me constantly. She admitted she'd noticed more than she ever said, and that part hurt in its own way because she'd been protecting peace while I was drowning. But she also stayed. She listened. She didn't ask me to be easy. That mattered. A lot. I didn't magically forgive anyone. I'm still angry. I think I probably will be for a long time. But something changed that day, something I can't pretend didn't happen. The secret stopped being mine alone. The burden got heavier for them, which is fair because it was never supposed to be mine in the first place. And for the first time, my pain wasn't getting translated into some cute family story about me being sensitive or difficult or a little too much. It was just pain. Real pain. Mine. I wish I could say the ending is neat, but it is. Some days my mother looks at me like she's finally seeing me and it makes me want to cry. Some days my father still looks scared of saying the wrong thing, which is annoying, but I'd rather have that than dismissal. We're not healed. We're not even close. But the lie is gone, and honestly, that's the first honest thing this family has had in years.
My roommate next door wasn't who they said they were. I moved in with Liam because his ad said chill guy, pays on time, night owl, and honestly that was enough. I didn't want drama and I needed rent split, so I signed the lease, handed over the deposit, and thought that was that. But from week one there were things that didn't add up, small edges you notice when you live with someone. The way he timed his smoke breaks to when the hallway was empty. The curt replies when I asked where he worked, bits and gigs, you know. The smell of cheap cologne always pinned to him like armor, and the way he kept his door closed at weird hours without headphones on, like secrecy for secrecy's sake. Low stakes, I thought, until the mail started showing up. I found an envelope on the doormat addressed to Evan Rhodes with an unfamiliar logo in my stomach. Did that stupid little drop. Liam laughed it off when I asked, said it was probably a mistake, said Evan was some friend of a friend who used to crash here, but then more came. Packages with names I didn't recognize slid under his door, bills tucked in creases with different handwriting, and a driver's license that tucked behind a stack of magazines, not Liam's name, not even close. It was one thing to be evasive about your past, another to have a wall of other people's names propped up like trophies, and of course I could have shrugged and minded my business, but the pattern made your brain look for pattern until it found one. I started watching, the sort of passive observation that passes for normal when you share a space. Where he put the garbage, what time he left, who texted him. But I wasn't snooping for kicks. It felt like building a mental map of a house where one room didn't belong. He kept a little lockbox in his drawer that he kept bolted even when I told him the lock wasn't necessary, and he'd flinch if I mentioned family like it was a live wire. People have secrets, they have reasons, but secrets that require fake passports and stacked identities are a different species. I found the first real sign of wrongness when I heard him on the phone at 2 in the morning, voice low and sharp, saying things that didn't sound like regular life, numbers, times, locations, then switches to a softer voice with someone who sounded scared, telling them not to worry, he's got it handled. He heard me in the corridor and closed the door with that practiced calm like nothing happened, but I knew something had. The apartment turned into a set of micro-alarms. The way he timed his cigarette to the minute someone came by, the nervous tapping when a neighbor's car idled outside, the way he stared down the hall like he was counting exits. I tried to talk to him straight up like a decent roommate. Hey man, are you okay? You seem on edge. He shrugged, a lazy grin that didn't reach his eyes, and said, I'm fine. Don't get involved in other people's problems, yeah? That line, too neat, too rehearsed, sounded like a script he'd used before. I started piecing together small lies. He had no real ID that matched his story, his bank statements were thin, and the job meant he was home most nights but left at odd hours for stretches. I found receipts for motel rooms in cities I'd never heard him mention, and when I asked, his silence was a thing in itself, loud, full of space. The more I looked, the more it felt like he had built a life out of misdirection, and that made me twitchy in ways that coffee couldn't fix. One night, the lockbox slid open while he was out, some of it my fault. I had been clumsy moving boxes and bumped the drawer, but when the key fell out, I didn't walk away. Curiosity is weaker than fear, but louder, and I told myself I'd just check for a passport or an old ID to settle my head. Inside was a stack of carefully folded letters, maps with circles, a laminated card that wasn't a driver's license but a badge with a department name I didn't recognize, and a notebook stuffed with names, dates, and short sentences like met at 21:00, confirmed, and deadline moved, disappear. My stomach flipped and the apartment shrank with every page I turned. My brain ricocheted through possibilities, none of them good. I closed the drawer and sat on the couch for a long time, listening to the hum of the building, the faint sound of someone laughing in another unit, the world going about its boring life while mine felt like a slow-moving bruise. I wanted to call the cops then and there, but there were things you can't unsee and things you can't prove, and if he caught me rifling, he'd know I knew. I thought about leaving an anonymous tip, but the more I read the notebook, the more I saw how small mistakes could balloon. His entries had a practicalness to them, not the frenzied scribble of a panicked liar, but the ordered notes of someone trying to keep multiple faces aligned. The badge didn't say police, it said investments on it in a font that looked like a knockoff, something official that no one actually checks until it's too late. I started flagging details. He used the same parking spot number every time he left, he always threw away certain receipts, and he had a pattern of visiting the roof at 3 in the morning and returning at 4. The roof visits were the thing that finally broke my passivity. On the third night, I followed him up. He saw me because he turned at the top stair with that same quiet awareness, like he could smell the trailing curiosity on me. He didn't slam me for following. Instead, he offered a cigarette and said, "You finally decided to get curious, yeah?" He smoked without inhaling much and talked like he was verbalizing a confession to an audience of one. "You see, people like me learn to make rooms for other names. It's easier that way." I asked directly why he had other IDs, why he kept a badge, and why the notebook read like log entries. He He stared at the city for a long beat and said, "I lied about a lot because lying is quieter than the truth." Then he told me the truth I hadn't expected, not some petty scam or avoidant history, but a string of desperate decisions. Years ago, he said he'd gotten tangled up with people who knew how to use a face, a paper, a name, the kind of people who sell stories to other people who need them. He'd started doing courier runs, small things at first, packages, messages, nothing violent, or so he told me, but it had escalated. He'd taken other names to avoid creditors and to keep an old debt person from finding him, and then other names to get into places, and then other names because when you wear a mask long enough it fits. His voice was casual, too casual, like telling a joke, and when I asked if he'd ever hurt someone he said, "Not like that, I keep my hands clean," but his hands trembled when he said it. The terrifying part wasn't just his past, it was his current calm about it. Living next to someone who treats danger like a household chore rewired my nights into a place of small calculations. Pack the important stuff, switch to different corridors, never be out later than him without a witness. I thought about calling the police, I thought about the risk to myself and the people I liked here. If he was connected to groups that trade in identities, whistleblowing could make me an immediate problem. I weighed the notebook against my gut and the stack of unanswered questions. If he was cautious enough to fake a life, he was cautious enough to find the people who'd notice a squeal. For weeks I splintered my days into safety rehearsals. I learned which lights stayed on in the common areas, which neighbor's dog barked at specific times, how to text my sister to check in without making her worry needlessly. I also started leaving small signs that I was aware, an emptied ashtray on the counter where his second cigarette would be, a note by the door that said "Don't forget keys," so he knew I was present. Maybe that was cowardice, maybe control. Either way, it gave me a sliver of leverage. He noticed the notes and joked about them in that easy voice, but sometimes at night he'd slam his door with real anger and I'd hear muffled shouting through the drywall, "I told you not in my building," and then silence. When the shouting got louder and there was a knock at 3 in the morning, I sat on the floor with my phone ready. There were footsteps in the hall, a voice I didn't recognize asking for Liam, and the tenor of the whole place shifted. I opened my door a crack and watched 3 people talk in low tones across from our unit, one of them holding up a phone with a picture. I kept my door closed and my phone on record because if anything went sideways, evidence would keep me safe. The strangers left after 5 minutes, but not before one of them squinted at the door and said, "You sure he's here?" That question was a knife. I didn't sleep after that night. The next morning I confronted him with my recordings and the list in the drawer and watched his face do something between a shrug and a panic tightening. He said, "You shouldn't have those." I said, "You shouldn't be keeping people's lives like props either." He looked at me like he'd been found incompetent rather than exposed, and then he did something I didn't expect. He offered me a way out. "Take my roommate's sublet," he said. "I'll give you a few weeks' rent, move out, no calls, no cops, just leave." The offer smelled like a bribe wrapped in urgency. I told him I needed time, and that night he packed 2 duffel bags. He left them in the hallway at midnight and slipped out while the building slept, and then he was gone. I debated for days whether to call the police, but I also didn't know what to say that wouldn't make me look like I was fishing for trouble. The envelope with Evan Rhodes' name was still on the table though, and the badge sat on his counter like a secret I'd been given and didn't want. I boxed his things that remained: books, a cheap record player, the hoodie he always wore, and put them in a bag with a note that said "left" and slid it under his door. I wrote an email to the landlord listing what I'd found and asking them to check camera footage and file it away. No accusation, just facts. Missing nights, strange mail, and the badge. I didn't want to get involved beyond that. There are lines you cross and some problems you avoid because they're not yours to solve. I also didn't want to become collateral in whatever life he left. Weeks later, a plain car rolled up to the curb and 2 people in nondescript coats asked around about a Liam or an Evan. A neighbor called me because she thought they were reporters, but they were gone before she could be sure. The building hummed with the small talk of people who survive by keeping to themselves. I sleep with the windows locked now and double-check the mail, and sometimes when a package arrives with a stranger's name, I hold it like a hot thing and decide whether to hand it to the management or leave it where it is. I still don't know the whole truth about him, how much he did, who he worked for, whether his "not like that" was honest or the best lie he could come up with. But I learned how quickly a roommate can turn from background noise to a live, dangerous story you have to decide how to end. Am I the asshole for ignoring everyone after they treated my depression like a joke? So I snapped and left the chat. Boom. I wasn't making a point, I wasn't doing some drama move. I was tired, sick of being the punchline, and sick of pretending that their jokes landed like glue when they were really knives. I've been missing plans, skipping classes, and spending days in my room because inside it feels like walking through chest-deep mud. Everything else takes more energy than I have, and you know what they called it? Laziness. They laughed, they made memes, they DM'd each other like it was story time about the weird kid who flaked, and Mason was the loudest, acting like my moods were a quirky glitch he couldn't understand and didn't owe patience for. So one night when he said in that exact smirking way that I was faking it for attention, and that he was embarrassed by me, something inside me finally snapped like a cheap lamp, and I told him to get lost and I left the whole group chat. It wasn't a dramatic monologue, it was 2 sentences and then silence. I didn't think it would light a bonfire, I just wanted to stop being the running joke, but they turned it on me like they always do. Mason said I embarrassed him in front of everyone and that I'd made him look like a bad friend, like him having feelings about the scene mattered more than mine. Then the rest piled on. I was being dramatic, I was punishing them, I was isolating on purpose to hurt them. They rewrote reality like my absence was an offense and their discomfort was the main event. Look, here's the thing, when your friends treat your depression like laziness, every missed text or canceled plan becomes ammunition for gossip. They didn't ask if I was okay, they asked why I wasn't entertaining them. They didn't check in, they edited me into a caricature, so I walked away. Was it mean? Maybe to their fragile pride, but do you know what's meaner? Telling someone who can't get out of bed that they're choosing to be sad. Mason acted like I had to perform a breakdown on command, cry real tears, post the playlist, say the words so he could verify authenticity. That's not friendship, that's a courtroom where I'm forced to confess. I didn't owe them a trial. Anyway, the group text filled with narratives about how I'd ghosted them and how they'd been so worry that never arrived while I actually was down. They swapped screenshots and sympathy theater, performing concern in public while privately mocking me. Even people who'd once joked with me about stupid shit suddenly adopted the role of injured party. That stung worse than the jokes, being recast as the villain when I was the one who'd been punched. I won't lie, part of me likes seeing them scramble for a hot second. It's a stupid human response to finally have space without being gaslit. But the deeper part of me felt hollow because I'd lost whatever safe spot I'd cobbled together with them. They were rough around the edges but familiar. Leaving felt like burning a bridge that was also the only roof I knew how to lean under. And that's where the guilt comes in. Am I the asshole for walking away? I tried to be the person who could laugh it off, who could take a jab and make a joke back, who could be cool with their teasing. It kept the peace but didn't fix the inside. It made me into a comic prop, which I guess I'm not cool with anymore. There's no tidy moral here, only messy survival. If someone treats your illness as a punchline, you have a few options: explain, educate, or exit. I tried explaining once, twice, even in small, clumsy ways, and each time they folded it into the same joke, so I exited. Maybe I should have done it better. Messaged people individually, explained the hurt, given them a chance to actually listen. But I was exhausted and raw and done with having my pain minimized into an anecdote. Also, leaving wasn't total cowardice. I told Mason directly, said words, and left the public space where the jokes reverberated. After that, their reaction proved the pattern. They doubled down on blaming me, performed moral outrage, and somehow turned their shame into my fault. That's a tactic I've seen a lot. Flip the script, play the wounded friend, and make the person asking for care the bad actor. So where does that leave me? I feel lighter and lonelier at the same time. Lighter because I'm not sitting through a stand-up routine about how pathetic I am. Lonelier because the people who once made me feel like I belonged are the ones who chose spectacle over support. If you're wondering whether I was cruel, I can own that leaving without a long explanation looked abrupt and hurtful. If you're asking whether I was wrong to protect my mental space from people who treated my depression like a joke, I can't see it. I think boundaries are messy and sometimes they sting. Also, I don't trust Mason to change because his first move was shame, not care. People can grow, sure, but growth looks like apologies that admit harm and actions that prove it, not group chat posts about how sorry they are while still making jokes in DMs. One illustration: imagine your phone battery is at 2% and people keep asking you to run apps you can't. They call you lazy when the phone dies. Eventually you unplug and throw the phone in a drawer, not to punish them but because you need to charge. Walking away was me putting my phone on the charger. I get that some will call that passive-aggressive, I call it survival. If you want to know the real hurt, it's that no one ever asked if I needed help, they asked why I wasn't entertaining them. That says a lot about what kind of friendship it was. So no, I don't think I'm the asshole for putting distance between myself and people who turned my suffering into a punchline, but I'm not pretending I handled everything perfectly either. I left abruptly, I didn't give them a manual, I didn't stage a reconciliation scene, but I also stopped giving my pain to people who made it a joke. If you're reading this and you think you might be the Mason in your group, here's a small test. If a friend says they're struggling, listen without performing skepticism, without needing proof, and without making their pain into a character trait. That costs less than 1,000 memes and could keep someone from walking away for good. Do I want them back? I want people who can hold me without turning me into a show. If they can do that, real apologies, fewer jokes, actual check-ins, maybe there's a path. If not, I'm okay with walking away again, quieter and firmer.
Am I the asshole for skipping my best friend's party? I texted Marcus that I couldn't make it, and then I shut my phone off because I couldn't keep listening to my chest tighten every time I thought about going. I lay on my bed and watched the ceiling and told myself it'd be okay if I missed one night, that one night wouldn't change everything. But the thing about being the guy who always says yes is that people memorize your yes like it's a contract, and they get surprised when you actually don't sign it. So when Marcus showed up at my door the next morning acting like I had personally invited chaos into his life, it didn't feel like a hurt friend, it felt like a verdict. He called me selfish loud enough that the neighbors could hear. He said I'd abandoned the team, and that we're all here because of you, which is rich, because I'd been carrying the platters for years, rearranging my calendar so everyone else could have their fun while I folded my evenings into little pockets of quiet I couldn't spend. I tried to explain that I needed a night alone, that I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix, but talking didn't help because Marcus doesn't handle nuance. He handles scripts. You show up, you cheer, you're fine. When I said I was struggling, he scoffed like I was trying on a costume, like feelings were props you throw on when convenient. Tyler, who'd been my shadow since middle school, sided with Marcus without asking me why. He said, "Jude, you always bail like it was a tally of social points, instead of a night's decision made to keep me from falling apart." That strung harder than the words, not because they were mean, but because they treated my silence as a technical problem to be fixed, not a signal that something deeper was wrong. I remember thinking, so this is what my kindness gets me, an exit fee. It wasn't a dramatic breakup with a fight and an ultimatum. It was a slow, procedural stripping away, one sarcastic text at a time. Someone in the group chat posted a screenshot of my no, and wrote a string of messages about reliability and responsibility, and how real friends don't flake. They framed my absence as a moral failure, like I had committed fraud against our history. It felt like being publicly audited for an emotional credit score I didn't know I had. Mom told me later that she'd had days like this too, when she stayed home and the world kept going. She said people will always prefer the version of you that's useful, not the one that needs something, and hearing that made something in me both ache and ignite. Because that's the truth. For a long time I learned to hide the seams, the late nights crying into a pillow so my voice wouldn't sound tired the next morning, the times I said I'm fine until I believed it enough to be pleasant at dinner. I took the role because it was easier. Praise came like small coins that bought me temporary daylight. Skipping the party wasn't rebellion, it was preservation. I didn't want to be the kind of person who laughed while my hands shook. But to them, my preservation looked like betrayal. People who only love easy parts of you will resent the parts that ask for attention. Marcus sent a message later that said, "We don't need you if you can't be present." And with that, he turned what I'd been learning into their verdict. I was unreliable, which in their taxonomy is the worst sin. That text broke something soft in me because it folded years of favors into one tidy phrase and tossed them away. I tried to explain that being present isn't the same as being available. It's a weird distinction when people measure you by attendance at parties and shorthand memories. I started to see the pattern. Whenever I'd been quiet, they loved the silence. They loved that my calm made their storms look smaller. But when my quiet was honest, when it meant I couldn't pretend, they acted like I had betrayed them. The next week at school, the air around me shifted. Conversations stopped when I passed. Jokes that used to be inside became louder and more public. The way kids will put a spotlight on someone until they look small. Tyler avoided eye contact. Marcus made a point of high-fiving everyone else right in front of me like he was showing an example. Someone said he always disappears, like it was a lesson taught to new recruits. I felt strange wanting to explain myself and also feeling too tired to start the explanation. I considered walking up to Marcus and saying, "You don't get to do this," but that felt performative too, like adding another scene to the play they already knew. Instead, I kept my head down and let things stagnate. People who had congratulated me for being steady suddenly recalibrated and treated me like a liability. It felt like discovering that a currency you thought was valuable was actually monopoly money. The final blow wasn't an argument. It was a party picture where Marcus was laughing, and in the corner someone had tagged me with a caption that said, "Where's Ethan? Lol." It felt like a stunt, a way of saying, "We noticed you missed out and we're better without you." I remember the cold tightness in my chest and how small my apartment looked when I opened their story and scrolled through smiling faces I used to be part of. The next day Marcus texted, "Maybe we're not meant to be friends," and the grammar made it sound like a legal separation, like we were signing divorce papers over beers. I replied with an apology that wasn't honest. I apologized for hurting him because that was the fastest way to stop people talking. He answered that an apology wasn't the point, that actions matter more than words, and he blocked me. That felt like a judge slamming a gavel. After that, others trickled away, not angry, but distant, like they were testing to see if I would protest, and I didn't. I didn't protest. I didn't have the energy to scream for fairness. I sat with the quiet and understood something cold. The friendship had always been conditional, reliant on my emotional labor and performance. When I stopped performing, they didn't lean in, they pivoted away. That night, I found myself at the edge of a small, honest panic. And instead of packing my schedule with explanations and parties to prove I'm okay, I started going to therapy. It wasn't dramatic. I texted a number, sat in a tiny room with a woman whose office smelled faintly of coffee, and learned to say small truths out loud. I feel hollow. I don't want to be who they expect. I need to rest. Saying those things felt like dropping coins into a jar. At first they made no sound, but over time the jar fills. Therapy didn't erase the humiliation, but it gave language to my exhaustion and a plan to protect myself from the pressure to perform. I also told Mom, not the rehearsed "I'm fine," but the whole messy thing, and she didn't tell me to go to Marcus's party or to apologize to everyone. She sat with me and made me tea and said, "You're allowed to be quiet." That permission was radical. People ask whether I'm the asshole. The honest answer is that skipping one party isn't the sin they made it out to be. Wanting to keep your head from unspooling for one night is a rational act when you've been the glue for years. I can see how Marcus felt hurt, of course he did, but the way he turned pain into public punishment without asking what was really happening says more about him than me. Ending the friendship hurt, but it also revealed what the friendship actually was. A ledger that only recorded my deposits of effort and never my withdrawals of need. I miss the history, the inside jokes, the afternoons where we do nothing and it felt safe, but I don't miss the drain. For what it's worth, I've stopped apologizing for needing rest. My no now has context when I can give it, and if someone refuses to accept that context, it's not my job to force them to learn it. I learn to choose people who ask questions when I go quiet, not people who write op-eds about my absence. The end of that friendship was loud, and for a while I mourned loudly too, but in the quiet that followed, I started to rebuild a version of myself that didn't have to be everyone's anchor to be worth loving.
I stayed quiet for years, then finally told the truth about my teacher's secret. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was standing outside the classroom with Micah's lunch bag in my hand, waiting for the bell to ring so I could drop it off before his break ended. He was already upset that morning, eyes red, shoulders tight, telling me he didn't want to go back inside because Mr. Jacobs had made him stay behind and talk after everyone else left yesterday. I remember laughing at first because I thought he meant the usual boring teacher stuff. Then he looked at me like I was stupid for not getting it and said, real quiet, "Grace, he knows things he shouldn't know." That line stuck in my head all day. Seriously. It just sat there, heavy and ugly, and I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that Micah was dramatic, that maybe the teacher had just noticed he was having a hard time. But he kept shrinking every time that man said his name, and I couldn't unsee it once I saw it. Mr. Jacobs was always warm in front of adults, always smiling, always that teacher parents loved because he remembered birthdays and clapped too hard at assemblies and said the right soft things about supporting children. In private, though, it was different. He picked kids apart in tiny little ways. He'd notice bruises, then ask where they came from like it was a joke. He'd hear a student mention being tired and make a whole thing out of it, like being tired was laziness, like pain was an excuse. Once he told Micah he was too sensitive to survive real life, and I watched my brother blink fast, like he was trying not to cry in class. I wanted to stand up then. I really did, but I didn't, because every time I thought about saying something, I thought about how people would look at us after, how they'd ask questions, how they'd drag Micah into it, how they'd talk about our home, our aunt, our money, our mother not being around, all of it. And I hated that I was even thinking that way, because a kid shouldn't have to pay for an adult's secret. But that was the truth I lived with. I kept telling myself I was protecting my brother. I kept telling myself silence was safer. Here is the thing, though. Silence doesn't stay small. It grows teeth. I started noticing how Mr. Jacobs watched the wrong kids a little too long. How he'd send everyone out of the room, but keep one child behind. How he'd use praise like a leash and shame like a lock. He was careful. That was the worst part. Careful people scare me more than loud ones. Loud people leave marks you can point to. Careful people make you question your own memory. I'd walk home with Micah, and he'd be quiet the whole way, then suddenly tell me he didn't want to go to school the next day. When I asked why, he'd just shrug and say, "I don't know. I feel weird there. Weird." That was his word for fear, because he was 11 and didn't have the language yet. I should have listened harder. I should have pushed sooner. I know that now, and it sits on me like a stone. Then one afternoon, he came home shaking so hard he couldn't get his shoes off. He said Mr. Jacobs had called him to the front after class, shut the door, and asked him why he looked so guilty all the time. Guilty. My brother was guilty because he was 12, tired, and carried his sadness like a backpack nobody else could see. I went cold. I asked him what else happened, and he said nothing, just that Mr. Jacobs told him not to repeat their conversation because people twist things. People twist things. That was when I knew this wasn't some mean teacher being insensitive. This was secretive on purpose. This was control. I sat on the edge of Micah's bed and held his hand while he cried, and I could feel something in me breaking open. Not dramatic, just clean and fast, like a snapped thread. The next morning I went to school and asked to speak to the principal. My voice was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. But once I started, I couldn't stop. I told her what Micah had told me. I told her about the students who always looked scared to be left alone with him. I told her about the private conversations, the shame, the way he acted kind in public and cruel when nobody was looking. I told her I had stayed quiet because I was scared of what would happen to my brother if I spoke. And then I said the part that made my throat burn. I was scared because I knew I'd been right to be scared. The relief hit first. It was immediate, like air after holding my breath for years. Then came the guilt. I kept thinking about every time Micah flinched, every time I told myself I'd deal with it tomorrow, every time I chose peace over truth because I was exhausted and young and trying to keep our little world from falling apart. The school moved fast after that. Too fast for Mr. Jacobs, anyway. They pulled records. They talked to other students. Then one girl cried in the office, and another parent came in furious, and then another. It all started unraveling so fast, it almost felt unreal. People who used to praise him suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Adults said words like concern and procedure and safeguarding, like they hadn't been standing right there all along, while kids were getting smaller and smaller. Micah sat beside me the night everything became public and asked if I hated him for telling me first. I almost lost it. I pulled him into me and told him no, never, not even for a second. I told him he was brave. I told him he had tried, because he had. He really had. And maybe that's the part that hurts most now. He tried before I did. He was the child, and he still tried. I keep replaying those years in my head, wishing I had trusted what I saw sooner, wishing I had understood that protecting him didn't mean burying the truth. It meant risking the mess. It meant letting the ugly things see daylight. I still feel sick when I think about how long I carried it alone, but I don't regret telling. Not for a second. He wanted silence. He wanted fear. He wanted every kid in that room to think they were the problem. Instead, he got found out. And Micah got to breathe again.
I found out my best friend was stealing my compliments. I was the first to speak, and I shouldn't have been because I didn't know how wrong it felt until later, but I remember the way Ms. Bennett's eyebrows lifted when I said the answer out loud, and the way Sophia repeated it like she had always meant to say it too, like a rehearsed echo, and I smiled because that's what we did. I answered, she confirmed, and everyone moved on like it was a neat little loop. But then there were other loops and they weren't neat, they were sticky. In chemistry class, I corrected the stoichiometry and got a small, polite nod while Sophia stood up at lunch and told Mr. Cumulo the exact trick I'd used as if she'd discovered it that morning, and people laughed and clapped, and I sat there with my sandwich tasting like someone else's name, and that taste stuck to my tongue for weeks. I used to be the one who would tidy the group chat, collect everyone's paragraphs, fix citations at midnight, because it felt safe to be the invisible hand that made things hold together. And for a long time being needed like that felt like proof that I wasn't fragile. It felt like an armor made of spreadsheets and on-time submissions. But when Sophia started to take sentences I'd written and deliver them at presentations with the same cadence and the same little joke, only louder and with more assurance, I noticed something hollow opening under the armor, like a seam splitting slowly. And the more I noticed, the smaller the armor felt and the more the seam showed. So I started keeping notes on my phone in the Notes app where no one would think to look. Dates, messages, exact phrasing, who laughed, who clapped, the little verbs used. I came up with, I did, I figured, because at first I told myself I was being petty. That friends borrowed lines all the time, that maybe I was imagining it because I wanted recognition, and recognition is a greedy thing. But then there were patterns, and patterns are hard facts in a world where feelings try to gaslight you into silence. I found an old email thread where I'd sent Ms. Bennett a draft paragraph about the community project. Word for word the same paragraph Sophia read aloud in front of the assembly, with the pride of someone announcing their grade. And I could feel my stomach drop, even as I listened to the recorded voice memo, where I'd brainstormed the phrasing 2 nights before. Memory and evidence began to line up like 2 witnesses telling the same story. And suddenly it wasn't me being jealous, it was my voice being recycled into applause for someone else. I didn't confront her at first because confrontation is loud, and I had spent my whole life avoiding noise. I documented instead, not because I wanted victory, but because I wanted to know whether silence would keep me sane or break me. Keeping the list became both a ritual and a secret. I added entries between classes, on the bus, in the middle of the night when an old conversation would replay, and I'd identify another appropriation. Another slip where she turned my careful explanation into her confident anecdote. The list grew like a quiet indictment, and with it my exhaustion did too. Carrying the world for people who then carried me out of the frame felt different than being taken for granted. It felt like being erased, and then presented again with someone else's handwriting. I talked to Mom about it in a way that was not a complaint but an attempt to translate my ache into something she could understand, and she asked if I had spoken to Sophia. When I said not directly, she said something about friends making mistakes and the value of generosity, and I heard generosity the way people often hear it in our house, as a rule that solves social knots by forgiving the person who ties them. That answer didn't help. It put a soft bandage over a raw place and wrapped my mouth shut. At school, when I tried to explain how it strung, That every time she took credit, it tightened the space I had to exist in, made me smaller in my own life. People tilted their heads the way adults do when a child says something inconvenient and called it jealousy, like it was a color in a box rather than a thing that actually changes your bones. "She's confident," they said. "You're just sensitive." And I learned quickly how casually institutions mistake gentleness for weakness, and how easily the world rewards the loud who make the same idea seem new. The first true crack came when Layla texted me a screenshot of Sophia's speech at the volunteer ceremony, where Sophia had read the paragraph from my email almost verbatim, and then, later that night, posted a picture of the certificate with a caption saying, "So proud of myself for leading this." And the comments were full of heart emojis. I opened the screenshot and my chest emptied like someone unplugged me. That night I didn't sleep. I scrolled through the list on my phone until the screen blurred, and then I scrolled more, and every line stitched into a map of small steals. A compliment redirected, a question answered then repeated as her discovery, a paragraph rephrased into a first-person achievement. The map wasn't dramatic, it was steady and patient, the kind of slow theft that looks like friendship until you stand outside it and count the missing things. When I finally asked to meet her, it felt ceremonial, like a function we couldn't avoid. We sat on the bench behind the library where the late sun painted us ordinary, and I tried to begin without the list because I wanted honesty to be human and not a courtroom transcript. But my mouth failed me, and I handed the phone over instead because people listen to evidence sometimes when they won't listen to feelings. Sophia's face didn't go red or pale. She was calm, the same even tone she'd always had when she corrected my bus routes or reminded me of deadlines, like she was doing me a favor. She skimmed the entries once, twice, and then she laughed, but not the breathless, surprised laugh of someone who hadn't noticed. It was a small corporate laugh practiced, and she said, "Maya, you make everything dramatic." "It's not stealing if it's helpful." Her hands were steady, the bench didn't wobble, the sun didn't fall. When I tried to explain that calling it helpful erased the labor I did to be helpful, that it turned my intentional acts into props for her performance, she looked away like she didn't want to be the villain, and then looked back like she didn't want to be responsible either. People around us, other students, a teacher passing, saw a quiet conversation and assumed petty bickering. Nobody jumped in even though the proof was on the screen between us. The thing about being the reliable one is you get practiced at minimizing the personal cost. You learn to smooth your voice into places where it won't make anyone uncomfortable. You become skilled at apologizing preemptively. You become an interior decorator of emotions. Paint over the inconvenient spots, place a plant, add cushions. But when the erosion is repeated and purposeful, it stops being an aesthetic problem and becomes theft, and naming it felt like taking a match to my own wallpaper. After the conversation, the scaffolding I'd built, late-night edits, the shoulder for projects, the quiet praise I let slide, split along the seams I'd been ignoring. The classmates who had always nodded at my suggestions now hesitated when I spoke, because Sophia had already planted herself as the source of those suggestions. Teachers asked her to expand on things I'd already explained, and in meetings where I was present, she sometimes phrased my ideas as a memory, a flashback where she remembered doing the work, which made other people smile at her and look at me with something like confusion, as if I were an unnecessary footnote. It hurt in a way that wasn't loud. It was a persistent ache, like a muscle you keep using even though it should be resting. So I did what the list had prepared me to do. I made a folder with copies and timestamps. I saved messages and emails and voice memos, and I organized them into a document with dates and contexts, a clean, unbearable ledger. I didn't do it to humiliate her publicly at first. I did it to stop doubting myself, to prove to myself that I existed beyond the echo. When I finally shared the document with Ms. Bennett and Mr. Cumulo, they read it, they blinked, and they asked Sophia questions in a way they hadn't when I'd told them in conversation. And there was, for the first time, a sound like accountability forming around us. Sophia was defensive. At first she denied, then she said she'd borrowed my phrasing because I made ideas easy to understand. Then she apologized in the tone people use when rehearsed words are placed like bandages on a bruise. And part of me wanted to accept it, because accepting felt safe and quiet. And part of me wanted to show every entry and demand an explanation for each small erasure. The confrontation that followed wasn't cinematic. There were no raised voices, no dramatic shouting, just a slow dismantling of the language we'd used to describe one another. Reliable was no longer a compliment. It was a role she had profited from. Supportive meant my labor and her performance. In that silence between phrases, I could hear something else. The relief of naming it and the betrayal of discovering the person who knew my stories best was the one who translated them into their own. The friendship didn't explode with fireworks. It deflated like a balloon you realize has a hairline hole. It sagged and folded in on itself until we both had to decide what to do with the pieces. For me, the choice was both small and enormous. I stepped away from the part of myself that exists to be convenient, and I started to refuse some of the invisible tasks I'd accepted as default, because when I didn't tend the scaffolding, it revealed how much of our social architecture rested on my labor alone. It was terrifying because without those tasks, people seemed to notice me less at first, and that absence felt like confirmation of the fear I'd had my whole life, that I'm only valuable when I'm useful. But it was also freeing in a brittle way, like opening a window in a stifling room and realizing you can breathe even if the curtains flap awkwardly. Sophia tried to mend things with a stream of messages that said, "I didn't mean to hurt you," and "I thought I was helping," and even a few public posts about learning to give credit where it's due. But the repairs were sometimes performative, like someone learning the right vocabulary without changing the grammar. People told me to let it go, to be generous, to keep the friendship because long histories are important. And those suggestions came with the assumption that my emotional labor was a cost I should bear for the sake of continuity. But continuity wasn't neutral when it required my erasure. The ending isn't neat. I lost the friend who could recite my achievements like lines from a play, and I found another kind of freedom in cataloguing and naming the small ways I had been erased, because documentation taught me how to trust my memory and to trust that my quiet work had weight. It was both betrayal and liberation. Betrayal because the person closest to me had used my words to build herself up, and liberation because naming the theft stopped me from absorbing it into my identity as if I were naturally small. There are days I still feel the pull to smooth things over, to take back responsibility, because it's what I know how to do. And then I remember the ledger on my phone and what it taught me about where my boundaries belong, and I don't do it. I don't think I will shout about it from a rooftop or burn bridges with flourish. I'm not a dramatic person and I never wanted to be. But I learned to keep my voice closer, to document more, and to let other people carry their own applause sometimes, even if it means I stand in the quiet and wait to be heard on my own terms.
I did something small, and it spiraled into the biggest decision of my life. I stopped answering them. I didn't make a speech. I didn't plan a dramatic exit. I just let the blue ticks sit there, and the messages pile up while I walked to the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and pretended the cereal box was the most interesting thing in the world. Seriously, that tiny refusal, not replying to the people who kept telling me depression, was just a phase, or something you can snap out of. Felt petty at first, like I was being childish, but also like the softest, safest rebellion I'd ever dared. At dinner that night, my Aunt Brenda asked why I looked distant, and I smiled and shrugged. And she said, "You've been so quiet lately. Are you on your period or something?" And boom, that was the match. I said, with my mouth doing the thing where it says things before my brain stops it. "It's not a phase, Auntie. It's not just sadness, it's..." And then I didn't finish, because finishing felt like handing over a blueprint for people to fix me. And I wasn't sure I wanted fixing by people who thought silence was dramatic and sadness was a hobby. So I kept being quiet, and the quiet became a hinge. Micah barged in with his homework drama, and I laughed and made a joke. And then the room shifted because I wouldn't play emotional valet for everyone anymore. Tasha texted the next day asking if I was okay, and I didn't reply for hours. When I finally typed 3 words, they were not what she expected. I didn't ask for sympathy. I didn't demand apologies. I simply said, "I'm struggling. I need space." She answered with a gif and okay, and I felt both furious and relieved that I could say the smallest truth without having to caveat it with performances for their comfort. The argument followed almost like clockwork, with Lena first, then Auntie, then Mrs. Nadu when she cornered me after class because she'd heard I was not myself. They accused me gently of being dramatic, Micah cried, because he thought I was leaving him. And I almost did leave him right there, but I couldn't. He's 7, and he believes my hugs are the scaffolding of his entire week. So I adjusted. I told Micah that I loved him, and I would still tuck him in. But I told everyone else, finally, clumsily, truthfully, that keeping quiet about how I felt had been killing me more than admitting it ever could. They blinked like I'd told them the sky was a different color. Auntie said, "But we've been helping you, haven't we?" And I realized their help was arranged around their comfort, their need to not watch me be messy. Their help had been more about lighting lamps for the room they preferred me to stay in than about putting out the fire I'd been carrying. That phrase, helping you, tasted like cotton in my mouth. I realized how much of my life I'd built around being the person who made other people feel okay. When you are a caretaker, by instinct, people lean into that like it's a chair that will never break. I had been the chair. That thought sat in my bones and felt like an accusation and a liberation at once. The argument simmered into a night of confessions. Tasha confessed she was scared she'd say the wrong thing and make me worse. Lena said she thought acknowledging depression would make me weak. Auntie admitted she worried about gossip. They all meant well. They all used words like "we're protecting you." And I felt both loved and boxed in. The more I spoke, the more I noticed the scaffolding, the family rituals, and the casual remarks, and the unasked expectations that had kept me performing being fine. I realized I'd been apologizing for existing in ways I didn't even understand were apologies until I stopped performing them. So a decision I had been putting off for years, the one that felt enormous and traitorous and necessary, unclenched and walked out of the dark corner into the light. It wasn't rocket science. I didn't sign anything dramatic. I simply decided to see a doctor and to keep going until someone believed me enough to help properly. Saying it out loud made the decision real in a way that scheming about it in private never did. It turned out to be the worst and best panic of my life. Calling the clinic, trying to explain without sounding like I was looking for attention, waiting in a room that smelled like antiseptic and lemon polish, and hearing a woman with kind eyes say, "You're not making this up." Boom. Those words cracked something. I felt ridiculous for wanting to cry, and also grateful that my body could still do it. The first appointment didn't fix things overnight. Nothing in this life fixes neatly. But it opened a door I hadn't known existed, because I had been using everyone else's comfort as the map for my own choices. When the doctor suggested therapy, I flinched and said the things people always say. "I can't afford it. I don't have time. It's fine." But this time, the woman on the other side of the desk looked at me like she could see the parts I didn't voice, and she said, "We'll find a way." And for the first time, someone acted like my needs were negotiable in a good way, not just tolerated. That small refusal to answer people had become a pivot. It freed up the space to prioritize myself, and every step after that felt like recalibration. This whole thing wasn't heroic. It wasn't cinematic. There were nights I crumpled on the floor and felt like a fraud. Nights I called Lena and begged her to tell me I wasn't selfish. And she did. She told me I wasn't. And then she hung up because she didn't know what else to do. I tried explaining to Auntie that choosing myself didn't mean I loved them less. It meant I wanted to be around longer and not be a quiet, drained version of myself who survived only to smooth other people's nights. That idea that self-care was actually care for others too was the part that finally stopped the oldest, meanest voice in my head that said I was selfish for wanting peace. The fight with family rewired certain patterns. They asked fewer rhetorical questions about my moods. Micah started bringing me silly drawings to my room, and Tasha learned to sit with silence without filling it with advice. Small changes, sure, but tectonic to me. People ask if I regret snapping at them, or if I wish I'd been kinder when I first started telling them. The truth, I don't. That small rudeness, not answering, drawing a line, was a rehearsal for me saying bigger, scarier things. Saying, "I need help" out loud is a muscle that had to be exercised, and the first rep looked clumsy. The decision I avoided for years, to put my health first, to stop making my life revolve around other people's emotional equilibrium, felt like choosing myself out of cowardice at first, and then like an act of courage. It surprised me how much of myself I'd been loaning out, how many of my mornings had been scheduled to make someone else's evening easier. Now I set a few boundaries that felt small on the surface. Not answering late-night calls if I was exhausted, declining to be the strong one when I wasn't, saying no to hosting family dinner when the emotional labor would fall on me alone. Those small boundaries stacked and made a framework where I could actually rest. And when I rested, I noticed things. I noticed how my laugh came back, how my words regained color, how I could be present for Micah without feeling like I'd collapsed. It still hurts at times. Grief doesn't have a timetable. But choosing myself unmoored me from the performance and let me start building something sturdier. Here is the thing. The biggest decision of my life didn't come from an epiphany on top of a mountain. It came from a petty, human act, ignoring messages that made me feel smaller. And from the dominoes that followed. It spiraled because honesty made people uncomfortable. And when people are uncomfortable, they either adapt or push back. And both reactions taught me something. They adapted in small, imperfect ways. They pushed back by asking if I was being dramatic. And in both, I found pieces of myself I had lost to caring first. If you told me last year that a missed reply would lead to me walking into an appointment and saying, "Help me out loud," I'd have laughed and said no. But here I am with appointment cards, with with Micah's drawings on my wall, with a list of small boundaries that feel like scaffolding rather than bars. I'm not healed. I'm not fixed. I'm learning how to be for myself in ways that don't erase my love for others. And that messy, quiet, ordinary is a decision that changed everything.
My dad tried to ruin my life, so I destroyed his legally. I remember the sound of his keys on the table like a drum roll before the verdict. Useless, he said, like it was a diagnosis, like he could prescribe me ambition and I'd swallow it and get better, boom, fixed. I didn't react. I sat there like a statue because yelling back would have given him what he wanted, which was a clean fight he could put on a shelf and point to later. But inside I was cataloging every word, every threat, every time he said, kick you out, like it was rent due next week. So I started keeping receipts, screenshots of the messages where he told me to man up and cut off my phone if I kept this up. Recordings from when he marched into my room and tried to take the bank card from my wallet. The exact dates I missed shifts because depression had me folded into the couch like a broken thing. All of it time-stamped and ugly and real. I played the part he expected. Apathetic, crashing at friends' couches, smoking too much and laughing like nothing mattered because he thought my mess made me harmless. He didn't check his messages. He left notes on the table saying he controlled my phone bill. He texted my boss with lies about my reliability. He emailed my university telling them I was a liability. Amateur moves that read like confession if you know how to file them. I found those emails in his sent folder when he left his laptop open, and I didn't even feel vindictive then. I felt cold and precise, the way you do when something that's been a bruise for years finally has a clean shape you can treat. I copied, saved, and labeled everything like evidence because at some point surviving stopped being about hiding and started being about strategy. I'd rehearse it in my head on nights I couldn't sleep. Hand it over, watch him squirm, don't cry, don't let him gaslight this away. It sounds petty, I know, but it's not petty when someone tries to control the air you breathe. So the day came and I walked into the family lawyer's office with an envelope and a face that said I didn't give a fuck, which was only half true. I watched his jaw move when he skimmed the text where Dad threatened to cut me off unless I proved I was serious. I watched his color drain when he read the recordings where Dad admitted he'd been forwarding my private messages to my employer. And the lawyer, calm professional, explained there were multiple civil and privacy violations, that coordinated attempts to isolate me could support a protective order and a restraining clause over financial accounts. I felt something like relief and something like grief at the same time, because this was the moment I'd finally put words to what had been a constant pressure, abuse dressed as tough love. He called that night, voice high and brittle, asking for a meeting, saying he'd been misunderstood, and I went because I wanted him to explain, wanted to watch the performance fall apart up close. He started with the old script, I was trying to help, you're lazy, and I handed him the list of dates, the text threads, the emails printed and bound like a tiny, damning book. He laughed at first, the kind of fake laugh that means the joke's on someone else, until he read his own messages out loud and realized the witness in the room wasn't a mirror but a jury. Then he stammered, telling me how he thought controlling my money would teach me responsibility, how he'd been scared, how he thought pushing me would break something that needed fixing. The excuses slid right off like oil. The lawyer interrupted, quiet and blunt, told him he'd already crossed legal lines, unlawful interference with contracts, harassment, and unauthorized access to accounts, and that the papers I'd provided made a neat case. Dad's face collapsed into something younger than I'd ever seen. Fear, humiliation, a thin, honest panic that's more pathetic than menacing. He asked if we could fix it together, said he'd apologize publicly, promised to reverse the emails and texts. I listened. I recorded his promises because memory is slippery and I wasn't going to trust a single earnest word without proof. The next week was theater. He apologized in front of Mom like it was a community service announcement. He sent emails trying to retract the lies about me to my boss in the school, and I watched every move, careful, surgical. But I kept piling protections on top of the apology. Formal legal agreements that limited his access to accounts, proof of contact conditions where he'd need written consent to contact my employer, and a clause that if he contacted me in the same abusive tone again, I could seek immediate enforcement. He agreed, signed it, and tried to smile like we'd just closed a deal. He was fragile after that, like a man who'd fallen off a pedestal and was discovering the hard floor beneath. People around us, neighbors, his friends, started to notice he wasn't joking about me the way he used to. They heard the quiet on the other end of the phone, the way he'd become cautious. He hated it. He misread my patience for weakness and tried twice more to pull the same move. A late-night message where he implied he was funding my rent so I owed him. A passive-aggressive voicemail about family responsibilities. Each time I took it back to the lawyer and we filed formal notices. Each time the consequences were real: fees, restrictions, and the slow burn of reputation loss in a small town where everyone hears everything. He tried a final gambit, public shaming at a family dinner, bringing up old failures in front of my grandparents, expecting me to fold. I stood up, walked out, and left the envelope of printed text on the table. He chased me to the car, hands shaking, said I was cruel, and I said, simple, I'm done being your project. I drove away with the stereo loud and my hands steady. There's a kind of quiet victory in watching someone who built himself on your failure have that foundation taken away legally, not by me smashing a window, but by courts and contracts and receipts that say he can't do this anymore. People tell me I could have handled it softer, that family should be spared the law. They don't know how many nights I sat with my chest hollowed out, how many times I canceled plans because I didn't want them to see me like that. This wasn't revenge for spite's sake. It was reclaiming the right to make mistakes without being criminalized for mental health. I still get angry sometimes. Old habits die slow, but I've got boundaries that hold, signed and stamped, and a small bank account he can't touch, and a phone plan that's mine again. He calls less. When he does call, it's careful, measured. The scary certainty is gone. I don't pretend I healed him, and I don't think an apology fixed years of triangulated shame, but I got the one thing that mattered in the moment. My life back in the space to screw up on my terms. My neighbor next door wasn't who they said they were. He moved in on a Tuesday, which already felt wrong somehow, like nobody ever actually starts a normal life on a Tuesday. I remember because the hallway smelled like paint and wet cardboard, and this guy kept his head down while he hauled in these 2 tiny boxes like he didn't own anything else in the world. I figured he was just another quiet dude. Hoodie up, eyes down, never said much. Perfect neighbor, right? No noise, no drama, no stupid music blasting through the walls at 2 in the morning. I was even kind of relieved. I'd had enough crap going on at home without dealing with some loud idiot next door. My parents were already on my ass about everything, my old man acting like I was some kind of disappointment factory, and the last thing I wanted was more garbage in my face. So yeah, I left him alone. Mostly. At first, he was just weird in small ways. Never used the same name twice when the mail room asked for him. Once he said he worked nights at a warehouse. Then, a few days later, he told the maintenance guy he was a freelance graphic designer. Then I heard him on the phone and he told somebody he was between jobs and didn't even sound annoyed about it. Fine, people lie about dumb stuff all the time, everybody does. I wasn't about to make a whole thing out of it. I'm not some nosy creep, or at least that's what I told myself. But then the visitors started. Not normal visitors either. I'm talking guys in clean shoes, no bags, no small talk, in and out in 5 minutes flat. Sometimes women too, different cars every time. Never stayed long enough to be called hanging out, more like dropping something off. Or picking something up. I started noticing because the same black sedan parked in the lot 3 nights in a row, then vanished, then came back with a different plate. I wasn't even trying to snoop. It was just there, right under my window, like it wanted me to see it. Then came the noises, low voices through the wall, the scrape of furniture after midnight, a thud that sounded too heavy for a normal apartment. One night I was half asleep and heard something like somebody puking, except it kept going, wet and rough, and then there was this sharp bang like a cabinet door slamming or a body hitting the floor. I sat up straight, heart pounding like an idiot, and I almost called the cops. But then the building went quiet again, dead quiet, too quiet. I started watching him after that, not in some full-on psycho way, just enough to see patterns. He left at weird hours, came back with different clothes sometimes. Once I saw him walk in with a gray duffel bag that looked heavy as hell, and an hour later the bag was gone. Another time, he came back with his hand wrapped up in a bandage, but the next day it was gone, like he just peeled it off and tossed it. When I ran into him in the hall, he never looked me in the eye, not once. He'd mutter some useless hello and keep moving like I was a wall. I told myself I was being paranoid. Seriously. That was the whole story I kept repeating in my head, because I didn't want to be the guy who starts seeing monsters in every shadow just because some weird loner lives next door. I already had enough people in my life acting like I was dramatic and useless. I didn't need to become the neighborhood joke too, so I stayed quiet. I acted normal. I even laughed it off when my buddy Cody said the guy looked like he was hiding from the feds or some shit. I laughed, but it didn't feel funny. Then one night I smelled smoke, not a little burnt toast smell. Real smoke, thick, hot. I opened my door and saw a thin line of gray leaking from under his apartment. My stomach dropped. I knocked first, no answer. Then I banged harder, still nothing. So I pounded on the door and shouted his name, whatever fake name he was using that week, and when I finally got a response, it was just one word: leave. That was it, no panic, no apology, just leave. I called the landlord after that, and she showed up with the master key in this face like she was already tired of everybody's crap. When we opened the door, there was no fire. There was, though, a room that looked like somebody had been living out of hotel trash bags and taking them apart in a hurry. Laptops, cheap burner phones, a stack of printed IDs in different names. A map with circles on it, and a wall that had been covered and uncovered so many times it looked peeled raw. I swear to God, I felt my whole body go cold. There was also a little box of envelopes with rent receipts, all paid in cash, all under names that didn't match anything. The landlord was standing there saying, "What the hell is this?" And I was thinking, oh hell no, this isn't just a creepy dude, this is something else. The cops got called. The guy was gone by then. Clean gone. His apartment was half packed, like he'd been ready to bolt the second someone got close. Turns out his real name wasn't even close to what he told anybody in the building. He wasn't some quiet warehouse worker. He wasn't a designer. He wasn't between jobs. He'd been using the place as a stopover for stolen electronics and fake documents, maybe more. The detective didn't tell me everything, but he asked a lot of questions about cars, visitors, timing, noises, and whether I'd seen anybody else coming in after midnight. That's when I realized how many times I'd told myself I was overreacting. How many times I'd let it slide because I didn't want trouble. Stupid, right? Yeah. The worst part wasn't even the fake names, it was the feeling after, like the building itself had been lying to us. Like every time that guy walked past a neighbor with his head down, he was carrying some ugly thing none of us could see. My mom kept telling me I should have reported it sooner, but that just made me want to yell because what was I supposed to report? Weird vibes, suspicious hoodie guy? That sounds insane until the evidence is spread all over a table and a cop is telling you your neighbor may have been part of a bigger operation using apartments like temporary storage. Suddenly, weird starts looking a lot like danger. I kept thinking about all the little signs I ignored. The lies about work, the visitors, the late night dragging sounds, the way he never used his real name, never made eye contact, never stayed anywhere long enough to be remembered. It all stacked up piece by piece and I still almost talked myself out of it. That's the part that gets me, not that he was fake. It's that I almost let the whole thing go because I didn't want to look stupid. After he disappeared, the hallway felt different. People locked their doors earlier. The landlord started asking more questions. One tenant moved out the next week because she said she didn't feel safe anymore. I get that. I felt it too. Every footstep outside my door made me tense up for a while. Every car that slowed down in front of the building had me looking through the blinds like a freak. And yeah, I was angry. Angry that some liar could move in, smile at nobody, and turn everybody else's home into part of whatever mess he was building. Angry that I almost stayed out of it. Angry that being careful and being naive can feel exactly the same until it's too late. So no, I didn't mind my business in the end. I couldn't. Not after that smell, not after the papers, not after the look on the detective's face when he realized how long the guy had been using that apartment. Maybe if I'd waited another week, maybe if I kept pretending I didn't see anything, somebody in that building would have got hurt. Maybe me, maybe worse, and honestly, that thought still sits in my head like a bruise. I found out my childhood best friend was using me for years. It happened on a stupid Tuesday, which feels fitting because nothing about my life has ever gone wrong in some dramatic movie way. It's always been the kind of weird, rotten, quiet stuff that crawls up on you while you're just trying to get through the day. Cody had been around forever, like forever. He was the one guy who knew how bad things were at home, knew I hated school, knew I could go from joking around to wanting to punch a wall in about 2 seconds. He always acted like he got it. Like I was the only one he could be real with. I used to think that meant something. I really did. At first, he was the friend who made everything less trash. He'd show up at my house when my dad was in one of his moods, and we'd just sit out front and smoke whatever we could get our hands on and laugh about dumb stuff. He had this way of making me feel normal, which sounds pathetic now, but when you're the screw-up kid in every room, normal feels like gold. I'd tell him stuff I didn't tell anybody else, stuff I barely wanted to think about myself. And he'd shake his head like he was on my side, like I was some underdog story instead of just a mess. That was the hook, I guess. He made me feel seen, or at least I thought he did. Then I started noticing little things, tiny at first. He'd repeat my stories around other people, but he'd make them sound funnier if I looked worse in them. He'd talk about how I couldn't keep my life together and laugh like it was just banter. I'd hear people say stuff back to me that sounded way too specific, stuff I'd only told Cody. At first I brushed it off because, honestly, I didn't want to think about it. I was already used to being the joke in a room. What's one more guy laughing with everybody else? But then I saw the messages, not even on purpose. His phone was sitting there while he went to the bathroom, and I wasn't trying to be some paranoid creep. I just happened to glance over when it lit up. There were texts from some guy I didn't know, and one of them said something like, "Did Jake really do that?" And Cody had replied with a laughing emoji and, "Bro, he's a walking disaster." My stomach just dropped. I felt hot and cold at the same time, like my brain was trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. So I checked more. Yeah, I know, great move, real proud of myself. But once I'd seen that first part, I couldn't unsee it. I went back through old chats when he left his account open on my laptop once, and it was all there. He'd been telling people my business for ages, stuff about my family, stuff about me getting suspended. Stuff about me falling apart when my mom lost it and I stayed out all night. He wasn't just talking about me. He was using me like some free entertainment. Like I was the guy he could throw under the bus when he wanted attention and then still expect me to show up the next day like a good little idiot. The worst part was how normal it looked when you just skimmed it. A joke here, a story there. A little "this dude is insane" thrown in like it was harmless. But when I read enough of it, the whole thing started to turn rotten in my hands. He wasn't venting, he was curating me, picking the worst parts, polishing them up, feeding them to other people so he could look funny or cool or like the one who had to deal with the pathetic friend. Me, I was the punchline for years, seriously, years. I stopped answering his texts for a couple days and he kept acting like nothing was wrong. That's what made me angriest, I think. Not the lying itself, but how easy it was for him to keep going. He knew I was too used to swallowing stuff to make a scene. He knew I'd probably laugh it off if he pushed hard enough. That's probably why he thought he could get away with it. So I finally told him to meet me behind the shops after school, same spot we used to hang out when we were younger and pretending we weren't kids anymore. He showed up all relaxed, like he thought I was there to smoke and complain about home or something. I asked him straight up why he'd been talking about me like that. He looked confused for about half a second, then he did that thing people do when they get caught and suddenly your feelings become the problem. He said I was being dramatic. He said it was just jokes. He said everybody laughs about their friends sometimes. Then he smiled like he was trying to calm me down and told me I should be grateful anyone even put up with me because I was a lot. That was it. That was the exact second something in me just snapped clean in half. Not in a screaming way, not some big heroic moment. It was quieter than that. I just stood there staring at him and I realized I'd spent years being loyal to someone who saw me as disposable. I realized every time I'd defended him, every time I'd made excuses for him, every time I'd told myself he was just rough around the edges, I was really just protecting the guy who was laughing at me behind my back. Embarrassing, I know. I told him to shut up, then I told him he was done. He laughed at first like I was bluffing, and that made it even easier. I walked away before he could say anything else. Didn't throw a punch, didn't yell, didn't give him the satisfaction. I just left him there with his stupid face and his stupid little excuse. And that was weirdly the best part. For once, I didn't try to save the friendship just because it had history. I didn't beg him to explain it in a way that made me feel less stupid. I let it be what it was. After that, it got lonely fast. I'm not gonna lie about that. Losing your best friend hurts even when he sucks. The silence is brutal. You notice every empty minute, but it was different from being lonely with somebody next to you who makes you feel small. This kind of lonely was clean. No fake laughs. No wondering what version of you was being told to other people. Just me in my own head, trying to figure out how I let it go on so long. And yeah, I still hate that I didn't see it sooner. I hate that I wanted it to be real so bad that I ignored all the ugly signs. But I'm not defending him anymore. I'm not pretending he was some brother to me when he was really just a coward with a mouth. Being alone sucked. It still does some days, but being the joke in somebody else's story sucked worse. A lot worse.
I did something petty, and it spiraled into the biggest decision of my life. It started on a Tuesday, which already felt like a joke, because Tuesdays always seem to show up just to make everything slightly worse. I was sitting in the kitchen with my phone in my hand, pretending to eat cereal that had gone soggy 20 minutes earlier, while my mom moved around like I was furniture. Not even bad furniture, just the kind you stop noticing after a while. Micah was in the next room doing his homework, and I could hear him sighing every few minutes like the math was personally insulting him. I remember thinking, I can't do this today. I mean it. I just couldn't. My depression had been hanging over me for months, heavy and ugly, and invisible in the exact way that makes people think it's not real. I'd said it out loud before. I'd tried anyway. I told my mom I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix, and she'd given me that look people give when they want to be kind, but don't want to change anything. My Aunt Brenda said I was just going through a phase. My friends acted like I was still the same Amina as always. So if I went quiet, they filled in the blanks with whatever was easiest for them. I kept showing up. I kept covering for people. I kept answering texts. I kept being the one who made things lighter. Seriously, I was exhausted. That morning, my mom had asked me to call the school and explain why Micah missed first period the day before. He'd been sick, which was true, but she'd forgotten to send the note. And somehow that always became my problem. I did it because that's what I did. I covered. I fixed. I smoothed things over. Then, when I asked her if she could sit with me for 10 minutes after dinner, because I wanted to talk about maybe getting help, she barely looked up from washing dishes and said, "Amina, can we not do this now? I've had a day." That was it. That was the sentence that snapped something in me. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I did something much pettier. I stopped covering for them. That same evening, when my mom asked me to text Aunt Brenda and say she'd already picked up Micah's medication, I didn't. I just sat there and watched the message sit in my drafts. Then Brenda called, furious, because apparently she'd told my mom she'd be dropping it off herself, and my mom had lied to avoid looking forgetful. Brenda started ranting about how my mom always twisted things, and I heard my mom in the background saying my name like I'd betrayed her. I should have felt bad. I did, a little. But mostly, I felt weirdly calm. Like if I was going to be blamed anyway, I might as well stop working so hard to prevent it. Then the wrong secret fell out. Brenda showed up the next day with the meds and a face like she was carrying a grudge in her purse. She cornered me in the hallway and asked why I'd been acting funny. I told her I wasn't acting funny. I was just tired. She laughed like that was cute. And then she said, too casually, that my mom had asked her not to mention how bad things had gotten with my dad before he left. I froze. I didn't even know what she meant at first. Then she kept talking, and suddenly it was all there. The late night shouting, the money disappearing, the way my mom had been begging everyone to keep quiet because she didn't want us to worry Micah. Worry Micah. Like I didn't hear him crying through the wall. Like I hadn't spent years swallowing my own fear so he could sleep. I went straight to my room and locked the door. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. I called Tasha because she was the only person who'd ever let me be ugly on the phone without trying to fix me in the first 10 seconds. I told her everything in a mess, half angry and half broken. She didn't interrupt. She just said, "Amina, you need to get out of that house for a bit." That sentence sat in my chest like a match waiting for air. But here is the thing. That wasn't even the real decision. The real decision came later, after Micah crawled into my room and asked, very softly, if I was mad at him too. That broke me. Completely. I looked at him, this kid who still believed I could hold our family together with enough patience, and I realized I'd been trying to survive inside a role instead of a life. I'd been the helper, the fixer, the one who didn't need anything, because that made everyone around me comfortable. also made me disappear. Boom. There it was. That night, after everyone was asleep, I opened my laptop and started looking up ways to talk to a counselor without my mom having to arrange it. I found community clinic options. I found school support. I found one line about emergency appointments, and I stared at it for a long time like it might bite me. My heart was racing, but it wasn't panic exactly. It felt more like permission. I also typed out a message to Ms. Naidu, my English teacher, then deleted it twice before finally sending. Can I talk to you privately tomorrow? It's important. The next day, I didn't cover for anyone. Not my mom, not Brenda, not the version of me that was always fine. Ms. Naidu listened, really listened. Then she asked if I was safe, and I nearly laughed because nobody had asked me that in a way that sounded like they wanted the truth. I told her no, not really. I told her I was scared of what would happen if I stopped being useful. She looked at me for a second and said, "Then we start with safety, not usefulness." I think I almost cried right there in the office. It spiraled from there, but in the way a door opens, not the way a car crashes. My mom was furious when school got involved. Brenda was offended. People threw around words like dramatic and ungrateful and selfish, which would have hurt more if I hadn't already spent so long pretending those words didn't describe me to them. Micah stayed close to me. Tasha checked on me every day. And me, I finally stopped treating my pain like a private inconvenience. I agreed to counseling. I agreed to staying with Aunt Brenda for a while things cooled down at home, which I hated and needed at the same time. I even told my mom, to her face, that I wasn't going to keep lying to protect adults who wouldn't protect me back. That was the biggest decision of my life, and it didn't look big from the outside. No dramatic music, no perfect speech, just me trembling, saying no. Petty started it, hurt sharpened it, honesty finished the job. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was disappearing.